Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching the Haitian Revolution Part 2, The Long Fuse by Extra History. Now last time we got an overview of the colony of Saint-Domingue, aka Haiti, looking at the different social groups and how tension was slowly building in the lead up to the Haitian Revolution. Today, I think we're going to see how that tension comes to a boiling point. Before we get into this one, I'd appreciate it if you guys would leave a like on the video, subscribe to my channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Now with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
Paris, August 26, 1789. The Revolutionary National Assembly in France takes the vote. At issue is a new document, drafted by Marquis de Lafayette, in consultation with his friend Thomas Jefferson. But in truth, many statesmen have given input to this Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. It borrows from the Magna Carta, the American Declaration of Independence, and both the English and American Bill of Rights.
Yeah, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen is the foundational document of the French Revolution. This profoundly important document that really lays out some of the founding values of this movement. As they mentioned, Thomas Jefferson played a big role in putting this together, which, was sort of beyond his authority. He was in Paris as the American minister to France. You're not really supposed to get involved in revolutionary politics in that role, but Jefferson really couldn't help himself. And so, because of his involvement, you do see a lot of influence from the Declaration of Independence in the Declaration of the Rights of Man, but also these very important historical documents that you can see arrayed here.
It begins. Article 1. Men are born and remain free and in equal rights. Social distinctions can be founded only on the common good.
You can see how this might conflict with the slave society we talked about last episode, this deeply unequal society in Saint-Domingue where 90% of the population was enslaved. And even among that 10%, there were still distinctions based on race, right? So this is clearly in contrast to this article laid out here.
Though they do not know it, these words will light a fuse that will burn all the way across the Atlantic and blow the slave society of Saint-Domingue to smithereens.
Now, I will point out, this idea of men being born free and equal was obviously one of the foundational ideas of the American Revolution as well. And some people involved in that revolution also took a look at that and said, hey, doesn't this come into conflict with slavery, the racial system of slavery we have? In the case of the United States, of course, a lot of the colonies and then the states kept slavery, right? And so, just because those words were written down did not mean slavery was going to be overturned. We have many examples of revolutions throughout the Americas and in many countries where a certain group of people frees themselves from some type of colonial domination or tyranny only to keep a portion of the population enslaved, right? So, just having this French Revolution did not necessarily mean that what we know happens in Haiti was going to happen. It was not inevitable. There are a lot of different decisions and events that need to happen to lead us to that point.
Like the American Revolution, slavery was always lurking under the table in revolutionary France. It did not go unnoticed that the revolution's rallying cry of liberty, equality, and fraternity was directly at odds with slave-owning society.
Right.
But there were also no illusions about the French dependency on the sugar economy of Saint-Domingue. And though abolition was discussed from the mid-1700s, even the most radical favored a gradual emancipation, with...
Yeah, there was quite a debate back in France proper, back in the metropole, over your more sort of enlightened types who perhaps wanted some type of abolition, though usually a gradual abolition over a long period of time, and a lot of people who said, just look at the money. Look at the amount of wealth we are making from this sugar production. Come on, we can't afford to abolish slavery. What would happen? And as we know, money speaks, right? So this was a big motivator. A lot of people thought, well, we can't quite end slavery now. Maybe give it another couple of years, or maybe do a slow abolition. I mean, we need to keep the sugar plantations going. And that was kind of the attitude for a while. Now, the French Revolution does shake things up, but like I said, just because this revolution happens doesn't mean that all of a sudden everyone's like, all right, slavery's done. No, there was still quite the debate, even among some of these revolutionaries.
Slave owners being paid compensation. Many warned that if nothing changed, a major Caribbean slave revolt was inevitable. Then, when the revolution came, representatives from the big whites, the Saint-Domingue plantation owners, and the free people of color both decided that the time had come to
Yep.
take their goals to Paris. The big whites.
So, the French Revolution is this major, major political event. It is a time when everyone, no matter what their group is, well, maybe not no matter what their group is. I guess if you're sort of a wealthy aristocrat, you don't feel like you could achieve much. But most people in society feel like, all right, now's our moment. We can get involved. We can make some changes, right? You see things like a lot of women at this time try to advocate for their own rights. Now, not a whole lot of progress is made. There is some initially, but especially by the time Napoleon comes around, a lot of that is sort of put back down, right? But a lot of social groups sort of see this revolution, and in this revolution, they see an opportunity for social advancement or an opportunity to sort of raise their group to earn some sort of equality, right? That's what everyone's looking for. And so the free people of color see this as a moment to try and get rid of some of this racial discrimination. And the big whites of Saint-Domingue see this as a moment to truly cement their base of power and to sort of separate themselves from metropolitan France, to remove some of the rules which they thought were unfair on their sort of production and trade.
Pushed for the colonies to have seats in the newly created National Assembly, so they could argue for more autonomy in the colony's affairs, and for the freedom to trade with the British Caribbean and the United States.
Exactly.
And the free people of color, for their part, were well ahead of them. For years, representatives from Saint-Domingue had been petitioning the government to grant the free people of color full rights, and they too saw the revolution as an opportunity to further that goal. Originally, they had tried to get...
I'm sure you can imagine you have these groups, right? These big whites and these free people of color. And keep in mind, of course, among the white and the free people of color populations, you had social stratification. But those who were going to represent their groups in Paris, these are the rich ones, right? So these are the big whites, the plantation owners. And these are the black plantation owners, right? The free people of color who had a lot of money, owned plantations, owned slaves. And so these are the wealthy among their respective groups. They're going to Paris, and both of these people want representation. But as it turns out, the big whites are sort of like, well, we don't want you to have representation. No, we want representation for the white residents of Saint-Domingue, white property owning residents. We don't want you guys to have representation. We want to do our own thing on our own terms.
The big whites on their side, arguing that as fellow slaveholders, the two groups had interests in common. So give the free people of color rights, especially voting rights, and then the two groups together could form a political bloc to defend slavery. The big whites, though, weren't having it. They opposed any reform to the colony's racial caste system. So instead...
Right, so there's sort of a racial element and also an economic element. These black slave owners are coming and saying, hey, we may not be the same skin color, but we've got a lot in common. We're both slave owners. Come on, our interests are in common here. Whereas the big whites, the white slave owners, are saying, no, that's not going to happen. We may both be slave owners, but these whites feel that they are naturally superior to these free people of color. Now, we talked about this last time, how these free people of color did not feel any solidarity, in the most part, between themselves and the slaves that they owned. Even though they were both black, they felt no shared solidarity. But the whites saw it a little differently, right? These big whites looked at the enslaved people and the free people of color, and they were worried that having these wealthy free people of color would give the slaves the idea that, perhaps one day they could escape the position they were in. Perhaps one day they could move their way throughout society. They didn't like that, right? For these big whites, they wanted to cement their position in society, not just through economic means, but also through racial means, right? They wanted to be cemented right at the top and have that unquestioned superiority, right? So there's sort of a breakdown here. These two groups, though they have some shared interests economically, the big whites at least do not think those shared interests are enough to actually collaborate.
Weren't having it. They opposed any reform to the colony's racial caste system. So instead, the free people of color made an alliance with an abolitionist society
Hmm.
called the Friends of the Blacks. And they argued that granting full rights to free people of color would be a major step on the road to gradual abolition. And here's where I'd like to pause for just a second, because this is the last time in this series where things will be relatively simple. Yeah, all of that stuff before was the simple part. Right after this point, both Saint-Domingue and France are going to use a technical historical term, go nuts.
Huh.
Everyone is going to ally with everyone else,
Right.
and then change sides 15 minutes later. Legislatures are going to vote for reforms, dispatch messengers, dissolve, reform, and then reverse those reforms before the initial messengers even arrive.
Yeah, so I mentioned this last time, but this is a deeply dynamic revolution. I mean, we've done plenty of French Revolution content on this channel. We all know how complicated that is. The same thing stands for the Haitian Revolution. It's very dynamic. People are constantly changing sides, switching alliances. There's really only so much you can cover in a series like this. 6 parts, each part about 10 minutes. There is so much to go into detail here. So I think it's a fascinating topic, but obviously we're going to be brushing over a lot of the events as we go through this series.
Revolutionary politics, in other words, is about to resemble a bag full of cats on espresso.
Hmm.
In fact, to even fit all of it into this series, we're going to have to gloss over the specifics of French revolutionary politics.
Yeah.
Who's in, who's out, who's making policy, unless it has direct impact on Saint-Domingue. And we're also going to have to focus on important trends rather than the specifics of who's allied with whom. And here's our first big trend. White colonials utterly refusing to implement moderate reforms.
Yeah.
Both the big and small whites were so committed not just to the structure, but the principle of their racist status quo, that even a proposal like rights for free people of color, which affected roughly 5% of colonial society and essentially had no impact on them, was unacceptable.
Yeah, so this population of white plantation owners are just extremely stubborn. They're unable to accept even the slightest reforms which may have sort of prevented larger revolts or revolution down the line, but they're not willing to accept it. Now, the situation we have here, they mentioned the Society of the Friends of the Blacks, right? This is an abolition society in Paris. Now, there's a competing society called the Massaic Club. This is a pro-slavery society, right? So you have these two groups that have been set up by anti-slavery advocates, sort of a combination of a lot of these white abolitionists and also some free people of color from Saint-Domingue. And then the Massaic Club is primarily these wealthy white slave owners, right? These plantation owners who have, many of them own property in Saint-Domingue, but they live full-time in Paris, right? So these clubs are operating in Paris, in France, right? And they're sort of both trying to influence the course of revolutionary events. Now, the Society of the Friends of the Blacks, you've got some pretty big names associated. Brissot, Condorcet, a lot of the members of the Girondin faction, right? If you don't know what that is, the Girondins were sort of the more moderate faction of the Jacobins, right? And the Jacobins were sort of the radicals, right? So you're talking about the more moderate faction of the radicals. Now, this all sort of changes as the revolution goes on, but that's essentially who we're talking about here. Now, it's worth pointing out some people in particular, people like Vincent Auger and Julien Raymond, right? So these are free people of color from Saint-Domingue, and they have very wealthy backgrounds, right? Plantation owners, especially Julien Raymond, is an extremely wealthy free person of color, right? So they own a lot of enslaved people, they own these plantations, right? So when we're talking about these free people of color coming to Paris, in order to sort of negotiate their position, try to earn more rights, not for the enslaved people, but for the free people of color. We're talking initially about people like Julien Raymond and Vincent Auger, and they're going to play a big role, especially Auger, in the revolution kicking off. But that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about this 10% of the population, which is the free population of Saint-Domingue. We're talking about politics within that group. We haven't even really touched on the 90% of the population, which is the enslaved people.
The second big trend to remember is the ideological flexibility of the free people of color, their ability to court different power blocks, and their sense that they had little in common with the enslaved.
Right.
Both these dynamics are going to come up again and again. The Declaration of the Rights of Man was almost perfectly calculated to tear Saint-Domingue apart. Depending on how you read it, it could be used to either argue full rights for the people of color as well as the abolition of slavery, or you could claim, as the white colonials did, that it didn't mention slavery at all. But the big whites knew how explosive this was. They sent word back to the colony to prevent word from spreading. It didn't work. Revolutionary politics was all anyone talked about at the dinner table. Meanwhile, the enslaved people, holding the trays and pouring the wine, started to understand that cracks were forming in the system of oppression that bound them.
Right. And so this is where, and we talked about this last time, right? Your slave owners, your free people of Saint Domingue, they look down on the enslaved population. Whether you're talking about the sort of small whites, this middling working class white population, you're talking about the big whites, these white plantation owners, or you're talking about the free people of color, these free groups primarily looked down on the enslaved people, right? They thought they were stupid and lazy and ignorant. Well, the enslaved people are going to shortly prove them wrong, and they're going to prove they've been paying a lot more attention than these free people thought, right? Now, of course, the slave owners, they don't want this revolutionary news getting back to the people on the plantations. But news spreads, right? People talk, right? You have, say, the occasional slave who may be a house slave, who may have access to this type of information, who maybe have the education to read. All it takes is for someone like that to pass that information on to the people in the fields, or all it takes is for an enslaved person to overhear a conversation, and that information begins to spread, right? So the enslaved people are aware of what's going on back in France, and they are aware that this could be their opportunity, right? They're seeing things heat up. They're seeing tensions build. They're sort of thinking, and the sort of planners among this group, right? Because there are going to be certain leaders that bring this revolution together. They're starting to think, all right, this might be our moment to rise up.
In 1790, Vincent Auger, one of the free people of color's strongest advocates,
Yep.
returned to Saint-Domingue, determined to cast a ballot in the new colonial elections. He believed that a piece of legislation passed earlier that year, giving all property owners a vote, made his case clear. He was a full citizen.
Yeah, so Vincent Auger basically comes back to Saint Domingue and says, I'm going to vote, right? It is my right. It has been confirmed by the revolutionary government back in France. All I need you to do is properly implement that policy. He's basically like, we're not talking about changing policy. This is the law. I have voting rights.
When the governor refused, Auger sourced arms and staged an uprising. Now, the free people of color had long been the backbone of the colonial militia, an arduous and expensive duty many whites avoided. Some had even fought in the American Revolution. So drawing on this experience, Auger's force initially...
And there was, and we'll see this, now this changes in form, but there was at times a certain degree of loyalty from that free population of color towards the metropolitan French government, merely because they felt the French government was the best protection against these racist laws implemented by these white planters, right? Because as we've seen, the biggest request of these white slave owners, what they wanted the most, was not necessarily full independence, but they wanted an autonomous Saint-Domingue. Their big argument was that Saint-Domingue is different from the rest of France, and it should have special laws. Now, what they really wanted is they wanted to be able to trade with their neighbors. They wanted to have exceptions from certain French rules and trade laws and things like that. They wanted to be able to govern their own affairs. Now, the free people of color understood if this white planter population got that, they would implement even more discriminatory laws against them. And so, in response to that, oftentimes, the free people of color would try and sort of cozy up to the French government, the metropolitan government, right? They felt that was their only protection against these white planters. And so that, in part, sort of explains that high degree of service in the colonial militia among this population.
Routed the local militias. But their success was short-lived. He only had 300 men, and a counterattack by regular troops sent him fleeing across the border into Spanish Santo Domingo. He was extradited, tried, and broken on the wheel.
Yeah.
But Auger's example,
Broken on the wheel, by the way. So he's not. Yeah, I know we're not into the guillotine era of the French Revolution yet, but he isn't shot. He isn't hanged. He's broken on the wheel, right? Essentially bludgeoned to death. This is an extremely brutal, sort of medieval form of torture, and this was very controversial, right? I'm sure you could imagine. One of the things that was true about sort of these slave societies, and this is beyond Saint-Domingue, right? They're producing all of these cash crops like sugar, coffee, tobacco, cotton, right? And these are getting sent back to Europe, and they are a big part of the economy, a big part of the way of life. Now, what is true is that a lot of people, much as today, you might not think that much about where you get your goods from, right? Most of the clothes we wear are made in sweatshops, all that sort of thing. You don't think about it. It's sort of the same thing where people back in Europe often didn't think about, well, where did this sugar come from? Where did this coffee come from? Right now, some people did, and they tended to be abolitionists, right? And you saw the occasional, say, boycott of sugar because it was made in these slave societies. But there is this sort of separation in terms of a lot of the people who are consuming these goods, they don't have to see the very brutal processes that got the goods to Europe, right? And that sort of eases the tension a little bit for them. But when something like this happens, this is a real shock to the system. Vincent Auger is literally broken on the wheel. When this news makes its way back to Europe, this is extremely controversial. The people back in France, even if they aren't the biggest fan of abolition or they don't really care about it or, rights for people of color, they say, oh my God, this is horrific. This is brutal to them, right? So this is, the sort of white plantation class. They do this to make an example out of Auger, but it doesn't paint them in a good light back in Europe. And of course, it only inflames tensions in Saint-Domingue, right? So I'm sure you can see how this doesn't really play well for them.
inspired other revolts.
Auger becomes a martyr, essentially.
Not just among free people of color, but also isolated slave uprisings.
Mm-hmm.
The big whites refused to compromise, even though the rebels were not even demanding full emancipation. They wanted their leaders freed, an extra day off per week, and the abolition of whipping.
Right.
Meanwhile, in France, Auger's death provided the Friends of the Blacks with new ammunition in the National Assembly. Here was a true revolutionary.
Right, exactly as I said. I'm sure you can imagine how you can really make this into propaganda, right? Vincent Auger, this free person of color who, was a true French patriot, a true ally of the revolution, who went back home to Saint-Domingue to simply exercise his rights, and when that didn't happen, he took up arms, like any good French revolutionary would. And what happened to him? He was violently and brutally executed, right? This, like I said, it plays very well for the Society of the Friends of the Blacks, does not play very well for the planters back in Saint-Domingue.
Martyred in pursuit of the vote. As the political winds shifted, the big whites still refused to make concessions, even forcing the assembly to refer to the enslaved using the euphemism unfree persons. These hardline tactics backfired. Support for the free people of color, even emancipation, was increasingly held up as a test of a member's revolutionary ideals.
Mm-hmm.
And on May 15th, the National Assembly declared that free men of color, born to free parents, could both vote and be seated in assemblies. The big whites responded by going home and starting their own revolt.
Yeah, they're not happy. So this is where you see some sort of shifting loyalties here, right? The big whites at this point, they had been, it depends on which big white you're talking about, they had sort of largely been allied with the revolution. Now they're like, wait a minute, things are not going our way. Let's form our own revolt. And now we see a bit of a different relationship here between the French revolutionaries and slavery than, say, the American revolutionaries and slavery. And we'll sort of see this as we go. But, obviously a big difference here is that you don't have slavery back in metropolitan France, or at least you tended to not have it, right? Outside of a very few strange cases. And you're dealing with slavery in a colonial context, in which, like I said, the people were sort of detached. And when they heard about it, most of them were pretty horrified. Versus in the American colonies, in the colonies that would become the United States, well, slavery is right there. It's a big part of a lot of those colonies, those states, and a lot of your revolutionaries are slave owners, are involved in slavery in one way or another, right? So we will see. Now, of course, in the end, the sort of French Revolution tries to re-enslave these people as well with good old Napoleon, but there is sort of a different dynamic going on here, and we will see that throughout this revolution.
In June, big and small whites organized militias, and by July, they were seizing power centers, coming into violent conflict with government authorities, and organizing all white assemblies that issued decrees that all but declared themselves independent.
Mm-hmm.
They essentially decided that if they were to preserve white supremacy, they must govern themselves. That
Yeah, and the big whites, they're going to lose a lot of influence as this revolution goes on. Initially, this is sort of your main players are the big whites, the free people of color, and metropolitan France, the revolutionary government. So the big whites, they've got a lot of influence as the conflict goes on. And, the 90% of the population rises up in revolt, the big whites are going to lose a lot of influence. And that's when they go to some of France's rivals, its geopolitical rivals. For example, Britain, trying to get some help from them. Right, these big whites, they're sort of leaving the revolution behind here because they're really not going to get their way.
That summer, the colonial whites fought government forces, and then they fought militias formed by the free people of color, who were furious about the all-white assemblies. Then, the colonial whites, along with government troops, engaged scattered slave uprisings. And in all of that internecine conflict, they were unable to see what was coming,
Yeah.
because the long fuse of revolution was about to hit the powder keg. Now,
Yeah, it's it's sort of funny. We're talking about the French Haitian revolutions. At this point, it's sort of like, if you were right in the middle of it and you couldn't see the future, you'd be like, yeah, the revolution's sort of in full swing here in Saint Domingue. We've got armed conflict between the white planters, the free people of color, these revolutionary troops. Everything's really kicked off. No, everything had not really kicked off. The real, like they said, we're still in the long fuse of the Haitian Revolution. The tension is still building. It has not truly exploded because even though for years now people have been warning, hey, if this slave society keeps up, this extremely brutal system where we keep having to replace people, there's gonna be some sort of major revolt. Even though people have been warning about that, the slave owners, they were scared of it, but they didn't truly believe it. They never truly saw an organized, coordinated slave revolution coming, right? I think in large part because, like we said, they had this stereotype about the enslaved people that they were lazy and stupid. They thought that they couldn't manage to do it, right? So they did not see this coming. This explosion was this fuse was right in front of their face, and they just couldn't predict it, and it really blows up in their face, right?
one issue with studying the Haitian Revolution is that the enslaved, the faction that would eventually win, were largely illiterate and left few records. So, piecing together the specifics of the uprising, particularly its clandestine origins, takes a bit of detective work.
True.
What we do know is there had to have been months, if not years, of preparation. Likely those enslaved.
Yeah, I mean, this is a large-scale coordinated operation across the colony. I don't want to understate that. So, like I said, there's some serious planning that goes into this that these enslaved people managed to keep sort of behind the scenes.
In houses, largely born in the colony and French speaking, overheard conversations about the revolution
Yep.
and carried the news to others.
Exactly.
Enslaved drivers and overseers, those with leadership roles, started organizing squads.
Right, and this is also worth pointing out. There's always some sort of stratification. Even among the slave population, there was social stratification, right? So, among this slave population, you had people at the top, right? These drivers and overseers. Toussaint Louverture, before he got his independence, was part of that group, right? He's someone we'll talk a lot about later in this series. And so, these are people who had positions of authority, even as slaves. And so, they're the ones who started to sort of lead this revolution early on, right? The leadership class of the revolution tended to be made up of these enslaved people who came from these sort of positions of authority within, the plantation.
In fact, the predominance of carriage drivers in revolutionary leadership suggests that they performed a major communication and intelligence role,
Hmm.
passing messages between plantations. Then, the night came. August 14th, 1791. Duddy Bookman, Vodou priest, carriage driver, and rebel leader, holds a meeting at night on an open plain.
Hmm.
Fires burn bright.
It's a very sort of iconic moment in the Haitian Revolution.
A tropical storm rages in the distance. A good omen. Religious ceremonies like this are permitted on most plantations and considered a healthy release valve, keeping insurrection at bay. Ironically, however, this summer, the enslaved have done the exact opposite,
Hmm.
using the unsupervised gatherings to plan an uprising. And Vodou is the perfect medium of exchange, containing elements of various West African religions. It's one of the few cultural overlaps that the enslaved have, no matter where they were captured. But this meeting is an emergency. A cell has triggered the uprising.
I mean, this is essentially a Creole religion that has come together, and by Creole, I mean sort of native to or created in the Americas, right? A combination of a lot of different West African, in particular, but African religious practices with some sort of Catholicism sprinkled in there, even maybe some other stuff, right? It all comes together into this one unique Creole practice of voodoo.
Captured. But this meeting is an emergency. A cell has triggered the uprising early, and upon capture, confessed everything. The
Mhm.
plantation owners, thankfully, had not believed that the enslaved could organize on the
Right.
level their captives described.
There's exactly that, right? So, like a lot of revolutions, they sort of there's this point when they sort of feel forced into action where it's like, oh, we might be revealed, but once again, these plantation owners and overseers, they just can't believe it. They say, no, there's no way, these slaves did that degree of organization and coordination. It's not gonna happen. But it's literally happening right in front of them.
According to tradition, Bookman and several priestesses extracted oaths and drank animal blood to seal a pact with the goddess of love. They swear to free themselves and free the land. Then they take up their cane knives and steady their souls.
Alrighty.
Special thanks to our educational.
There we go. That is the end of episode 2, The Long Fuse. So this is essentially the end of the build-up to this revolution, right? The tension's been building, 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 and next time we will see it explode as, once again, that 90% of the population, the enslaved people, take up arms, and this revolution truly kicks off. Another good episode of this series. I'll probably repeat this throughout the series, but so many details. There's only so much we can cover. We'll have to gloss over some of it, but some really interesting stuff. So if you guys enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. It'll give you access to exclusive reaction videos. Pretty nice, huh? So, I hope you guys are having a great day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.